Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, a collection of his pieces from the Wînipêk Free Press, now bound and out. Niigaan Sinclair joins me on the program to discuss it. Welcome to the show, Niigaan.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You have three different phonetic pronunciations for the book title, and I'm curious which one you use.
Wînipêk.
Wînipêk. Okay. This is a book that obviously, as I mentioned, is a collection of articles, but I have to imagine in going back to them and figuring out kind of what would be bounded in this collection, did you revisit some of those articles and recontextualize them, or are they presented as they first appeared in the paper?
Yeah, no, they are completely redone. Almost every single one of them has been reworked in some way at some level. It's amazing when you write columns. I write 2 columns a week, sometimes one, for the Free Press here in Wînipêk. How many times you say things like this week or last year or next month, like it's amazing how many time markers you put into your columns.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's made me really think about my writing. But it's also made me, realize that when you're a column writer, you're really in the moment. And so 2 things had to happen. I take out all the time markers, but then I also had to make pieces sound a little bit more ahistorical, sort of like general thoughts or like big picture ideas. And so while I do talk about very specific things, I relate all those things to the broader message of the book, which is that in Wînipêk, you're seeing what is the future of Canada, which is a real requirement, a fact that each one of us live in this country together, and what happens to one of us happens to all of us. And so while we've been at this project of colonization in Canada and violence for a long time, we've also been at the solutions the longest in this place, as the first footsteps of Confederation, the first treaty, numbered treaty, and then, of course, the fact that, each one of us are related to each other in this place. And so we've been thinking about what it means to live together as Indigenous and Canadian peoples for a long time.
And it's obviously something that you've been wrestling within your weekly columns, but then re-examining those within the context of putting them in this book. Then, are you seeing recurrent motifs or things that you have kind of like really hit on, and how much are you figuring out kind of what works together, because you've grouped this into 4 sections, but in some ways there's kind of a slipperiness to those sections, right? That certain things I think at least could go in multiple sections or address topics that are echoes of each other within the different sections.
Yeah, so the book's split up into 4 sections. And what I do is, even though I wrote it over 5 years, I think of it in terms of seasons. So kind of, in traditional Indigenous worlds, Anishinaabe worlds, where my people, there's certain work that's being done at certain times of the year. So certain things that happen only in springtime, certain things that only happen during the winter, certain things only happen during summertime. And so what I do is I've been looking at the ways Wînipegers, Indigenous peoples, Canadians, are working together, living together, making families together. And what I've noticed is that at certain times of the year, we have different interests and goals and activities. Like, for example, hockey is a pretty important part of it. So obviously that's during the winter time, and particularly in the springtime, when the Wînipêk Jets go on a playoff run, or the hockey teams in the city have relationships or simply refuse to travel to First Nations, and what does that mean, and those kinds of things. And so there's a whole host of different ways that the book addresses that, and it's split up into thinking about what is it that's taking place in this massive area that is both problematic but then also evident of change and solutions. Like a real big solution, for example, is all the urban reserves that are happening in the downtown area, or the fact that First Nations, while corporations, US corporations, are leaving this city, en masse and leaving big gaping holes or big concrete buildings. It is First Nations that are coming up with the solutions, like we have always done in this place, to figure out how do we navigate and live in this place, even though we've had extraction or we've had people who have come here and taken things. And we've had elements of the country that treats us like a resource colony. How do we, as people who live, breathe, thrive in this place, how do we make sure that this place is a place of life?
Yeah, you mentioned corporations leaving. Obviously, one of the pieces you have is about the Hudson's Bay building downtown and the return of the pelts that, like, essentially kind of negating the contract, as it were, and that ultimately you say this is a reconciliation step, that taking over and reimagining what this space was and what it can mean for the population. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, is that, like, because you mentioned kind of revisiting things that you'd originally written, like, was that part of the initial premise, or was that something that you landed on afterwards in the edit?
Yeah, it's funny you talk about revisiting. That's actually what the pelts were about. It was a revisiting of the agreement between First Nations people and the Hudson Bay Company, and the ways in which trade or furs were offered. And so there was a revisiting of that relationship by the Southern Chiefs, Grand Chief Jerry Daniels, who went down to New York to meet with the Hudson Bay Company governor. And he returned, or he offered furs to revisit the agreement of committing to that community. And, handing over that building, that monstrosity of a building in downtown Winnipeg, which at the time of its creation was the most amount of concrete in any building in Western Canada, and I believe Canada. But the amount of concrete that would take to remove is more expensive than demolishing the building and then trying to rebuild something else. Like, it's so expensive to try to demolish that building. So what the choice that First Nations had is how do we remake something that has been a real monument of violence? And that really is what that project is all about. And so I think of Winnipeg in this kind of the same way. The opening of the book is talking about the remaking of the statues in the downtown and around the Manitoba legislature, those two statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth, and how those were made into really beautiful markers about this place. They were not vandalism. It was not violence. Nobody died, unlike other instances in Winnipeg when activism happened, particularly the Winnipeg General Strike. They're pictures of beauty. They're pictures of statements, and they're about life in this place. That's what Winnipeg really looks like. It's how do we, after the disaster of the past 150 years, the violence, the genocide that's taken place, how do we remake our lives in instances of beauty from those elements of the old, and remake those things into parts of life, and so you see that happening everywhere. You see that with the downtown patrols helping people in encampments. You see that with sports teams in the city putting Indigenous logos on their helmets, and having songs sung in languages, or powwow dancers bring out teams or drums. You see that with people who are demanding more of premiers. We've had the last two premiers in Manitoba voted out or forcibly removed because of what they've said about Indigenous peoples, the inappropriate things they've said about Indigenous peoples. And frankly, Manitobans have had enough. They're not going to tolerate that anymore, because we're all in this thing together. And I think that's one of the great things about this place, is that you don't see that elsewhere. You don't see a politician saying a racist thing about Indigenous peoples, and just simply getting away with it. Like, that happens elsewhere. It doesn't happen here. It's not appropriate for that to happen in this place anymore. And so that means that we all are turning a corner or taking a step in a direction towards what we might one day call reconciliation.
Yeah, you in the piece on Pallister, you write about what he said, and the fact that, like, basically 20% of the people that he governs are Indigenous, and I was struck back thinking, around the time of the COVID vaccine, and how he had quoted that said that this would put Manitobans at the back of the line, And I was struck by the fact that like he was excluding Indigenous Manitobans from what he considered Manitobans.
Yeah, I mean, here's a fact. And this isn't just about Brian Pallister. This was, equally stupid things were said by Jean Chrétien. And when he said that he had never heard about abuses in residential schools, that's absurd. That is like clearly you didn't listen, or you're ignoring, or at the very worst case scenario, you're just misrepresenting what Indigenous peoples have been saying to you for years and decades when you were in office. Same thing with Brian Pallister. So simply by just ignoring or misrepresenting Indigenous peoples, I mean, the fact is we all are Manitobans. Like, go and watch a Wînipêk Jets playoff run, or go look on September 30th when we're all wearing orange shirts, or go to the downtown area when a young Indigenous woman is found murdered and then cast away into the Red River. The fact is that Manitobans and Indigenous peoples, they, not everybody, of course, but they care about each other. They know that we are all in this thing together. Every single one of us have a member of our different communities and cultures in our family trees. Like my stepfather is Icelandic. My two parents come from both Indigenous and British and French communities. My family has not just Ojibwe in our background. We also have Cree, we have Lakota Dakota in our background. And of course, for many years, when we were forcibly removed, we were parts of the Manitoba Métis Federation. So, we're all in this thing together. And that's the amazing thing, I think, about Manitobans is they just won't tolerate factually incorrect things anymore. Every single one of us learned the wrong story growing up. We learned a story that Indigenous peoples are deficient in problems and uncivilized, and that Canadians are superior and problem solvers and are the only people worth talking about. That's a false story. That's a lie. And the fact is that we all matter. We all belong in this place. And that it's not just on September 30th when we all wear an orange shirt, but it's every day. It's when we go to the voting booth. It's when we go to school or we work, or it's even when we go to the folk festival. The Wînipêk Folk Festival. We are all in this together.
You mentioned the process was 5 years for the book. What started the process for the book? I mean, obviously you were doing the columns regardless, but like at what point did this become like a cogent idea that this was going to happen?
It's hard to put a finger on exactly where I came up with first of all, I had to be convinced really, because I had another book that I was working on. I was working on my dad's memoir, and so my dad's memoir actually comes out later this year. And in the process of speaking with the agent and the book company, McClel and Stewart in Toronto, through that process, they invited me to consider doing a book. And as they had me work with an editor, a really wonderful woman named Haley Cullingham, who is just one of the greatest people I've ever met in my life, and just a really special person who helped me see the book in a much more tangible way, in a much more cogent way. And so working with her, we began to assemble pieces, and she basically picked about 40 pieces together. There's about 80 pieces in the book, but she picked about 40 that said, these are the pieces that really should need to be in this book. And without her, this book would have never been done. So, thanks to Haley for the work that she did to help navigate me, and also to help me see that that people would want to read this book, that the book could be a possibility. It could be a reality.
So she had a sense of half of it. How did you come up with the other half then?
So what happened is she didn't really have the themes. She didn't really have the way in which I imagined the book. She just picked the 40 poems that she liked. And so I kind of went, oh, okay, well, this belongs here and this belongs here. And so I started dividing them up, and I realized that I was really talking about work that was done at certain times of the year in our communities. And when the newcomers showed up in our communities, when Europeans showed up here, they showed up in late October, September. And so many of them died by Christmas. And they had to be lifted by Peguis, the Selkirk settlers, and taken down to Fort Pembina. And that tells you a lot about how important the seasons are here in Manitoba. If you're not prepared, if you're not doing the work necessary to prepare for life in this place, if you don't work with the earth, if you don't work with the land and with the water, you die. And so that's really, I think, an important message of what happens in the book, which is that, when I started looking through and I started compiling, then I realized, oh, I wrote this other column. This belongs in this section. This column belongs in this section. There's a few columns that actually I never wrote for the Wînipêk Free Press. I wrote when I was writing for other newspapers or other news companies. And so they're all in that book, though. So there'll be some pieces that people will know and be familiar with. But there's also many pieces that people will have never seen before.
The piece called Meeting Site that you talked to Kevin Brownlee at the Manitoba Museum about the shards that contain the Treaty of 1285. It got me thinking, because he talks about all the work that would have gone into getting everyone together to make the treaty, and that the treaty is kind of a fixed point in time, but there's so much that needed to be considered about what led to that moment. And it really got me thinking about kind of this book is, in some ways, not just in you writing these kind of dispatches, as a column and then kind of revisiting them, that we try to put fixed points on everything and then maybe disregard what goes into like the lead up and then the follow through. And then in some ways that's kind of a metaphor for reconciliation. And
also, like how people get over things or certainly move through things when there's an emergency. I just recently recorded a podcast with Dr. Joss Reimer, who was headed up the COVID vaccine rollout here in Manitoba, and is now the president of the Canadian Medical Association, former chief medical officer of the Wînipêk Regional Health Authority. And one of the things that I spent time talking with her about was about how the pandemic made decolonization happen faster. And part of that was because people got over things. They, for instance, it's better that Indigenous peoples advocate for Indigenous peoples when it comes to health. And so therefore they need to be equipped with the right information. They need to be standing at the podium and leading that conversation with Manitobans about how do we bring the vaccine to First Nations, et cetera. So the reason I'm bringing up that story is because that's the exact lesson that was from 1285. The lesson from 1285 was there was a massive mega drought that had hit Turtle Island or North America. And people were starving. People didn't have the vegetation. The buffalo wasn't coming as far south. And the fact was that people were starting to turn on each other, and people started to war with different nations. Nations that had never warred before were starting to war over resources and goods and food. And so the amount of diplomacy that it would have taken to get hundreds of people to come to what's now known as the Forks, or in Cree we call Nestawea, 3 points where the rivers come together. It would have taken just an overwhelming, it's almost like overwhelming in the ability to think about the sheer magnitude of trying to convince people who were at conflict to, for a while, get over their conflict and then come together and make decisions. It is a pretty remarkable sight that is in the downtown of Wînipêk, and people don't know that history. People, you can go up in school in Manitoba and never learn about the treaties that were made between Indigenous nations, or that there's treaties between bears and fish, or that there's treaties between the sun and the moon. And that the treaty making is such a old practice here. It's not something that starts with Treaty 1, and certainly doesn't start with Europeans arriving. Treaties start when life begins in this place. In fact, the very first life in this place would probably be the Attigib or the algae, which is what makes that word Wînipêk, is referring to what floats in the water. So that's the algae. The algae is really the first inheritor, or the first being that lives in this place. And so everything else comes after. And that's really what I think is important to remember, which is that there are many different ways that we can see this place, and we should always begin with those who have been here the longest. And that's where that 1285 treaty comes from.
Yeah, and I just found it fascinating because like Kevin's take on it being like, you know, the lead up and then the follow through, and that like we do tend to kind of fixate on a specific point or an anniversary or things like that. And it made me think back to the introduction that you talk about, you know, that Canada Day, that you refer to it as an editing, as what happened with those statues.
Yeah,
and
that's what it was.
You know, that's editing is a process, right? Like that you may end up with like a finished document, but the process is kind of the critical thing, like the taking something that was fixed and revising it.
100%. Like the fact is that, you know, even though the then premier of Manitoba, even Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, you know, called these remaking of the statues at the Manitoba Legislature in Canada Day 2021 as vandalism, as violence, as, you know, all the different terms that they threw around. In fact, it was none of those things. It was people felt seen for the first time. People felt honored and recognized and validated. People realized that a Manitoba, whether you drove by it and saw it, or whether you watched it, or whether you participated in it, that Manitoba necessarily and always eternally will include Indigenous peoples, and that Indigenous peoples are at the center of every conversation in this place. And so let's begin with that, with making monuments that look like that. Because what we realize is that we're not casting away Canadians or Europeans. We're not canceling anything. In fact, there's nothing, like we could remove all the statues of Queen Victoria and her legacy would still be profound here, because there's the train line that I'm looking at through a window right now. There's all of the concrete that goes on top of Indigenous trading routes. Those all are where when Queen Victoria set forth the colonial agenda to create an empire and expand the empire in the British Empire into North America. And the reality is that none of this is about something we should be afraid of. This is something that would be a positive and vital and crucial, beautiful move for our community, which is what the remaking of the statues at 2021 look like.
That kind of takes me back to the Hudson's Bay building, and that like the cost, like we can't undo the concrete and the resource extraction that went into building that thing, but we can think about kind of what we can do with it going forward, or, you know, imagine a different path now from it.
There's a phrase that we have in Ojibwe. It's Niiman Wendam Omayayan. And what it means is I'm joyous for all the things that have brought us together. And that means the good, the bad, but it also means the really ugly. It means the remarkable miracles that happen to bring us together. Because all it would have taken is for you to make one decision, or something happen to you, or for just creation to intervene in some way, and you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be hosting this show. You wouldn't be a person at a radio station. You wouldn't be a person who's even at a university. There's a million reasons for you not to be here today, but it is the fact that you're here and that I'm here. It's a miracle. It's a miracle that we are here. And that ultimately, I think, is what we're talking about when we offer gifts to one another.
You used a term there that, you know, it recalls me, one of the pieces is about language and the course that you introduced here at the University of Manitoba, and language preservation and revitalization, and the fact that you're still hoping to produce a fluent speaker of an Indigenous language through the University of Manitoba. Obviously, in other stories you relate. Pardon me?
I was just saying that's the gold standard of any language program, is can it produce a speaker?
Mm-hmm. And it occurs to me that like recurrently, like when you're working with Mama Bear Clan and on the street, you do encounter people who are speaking almost entirely in their Indigenous language, and that the language is out there, but the academic world is maybe playing catch up on that.
Yeah, one of the frustrating things about universities is they don't think in terms of long term. I mean, like a typical term for, let's say, a university president or a dean or, a vice president or, anyone who makes decision making at a university is very similar to government. It's usually a short term, 3, 4, 5 years. So what that means is you get a mentality in the university of instant gratification or the instant reaction or instant impact. Well, the problem is that you'll never save a language that way. It's impossible. It's impossible to say, okay, we're going to learn the language in 1 year. Learning a language is a lifetime of work. People who have been in the language and been exposed to it and spoke the language, it takes some decades upon decades upon decades to learn the nuances. And even then, like we are still, for instance, right today, still mastering or engaging or remaking or reimagining English. So like you and I are just practicing it right now because we're speaking it. We might say something a little bit different tomorrow once we learn what we learned today. And even the way we pronounce words or the words, what words mean, all of those things are shifting all the time. And the hope is that there's a commitment and that pointing these things out at a university might be able to help that we might actually one day produce a language speaker.
Well, thinking long term is obviously something that you're doing. As you dedicate the book to your daughter, you think about kind of the world that she'll inherit, and I think that this book goes some ways to thinking about the future, even though it's pulled from articles from the past. Like you said, they're dispatches, so they were very much in the now, and then now kind of recontextualized.
Oh yeah, yeah. My hope is that the way that I always think about it is my father was the first of an industry or the first of a province. So he was the first Indigenous judge in Manitoba history. He was oftentimes the first Indigenous lawyer that anybody would ever meet. One time the judge actually thought that he was the accused. My father was also the first of our family to go to university and to go to ascend and get a full-time job in Wînipêk. So every Indigenous person is a first. And that's my generation too. But my job is a little bit different than my father. My job isn't to be a first of a province or first of an industry or first person in the room. My job is to be a critical mass and to try to build the infrastructure and support so that there's more of us that come through these institutions. And then my daughter's generation they're literally going to create a whole new institution, a whole new body of work and ways in which we imagine ourselves. They're going to be the poets and the dreamers. Many of them already are. And so that's how I think of the work. I think of the work as my father's job was to be the first in an entire province. My job is to build the infrastructure within that room. And then my daughter's job is to make a whole new room.
So in some ways, these are kind of like architectural blueprints for those visions.
Yeah, like each piece in the book was kind of indicating like what it is that we're doing now in this place, and very much in the kind of realm of my daughter, of we're making things that have never been seen before. And as a result, change is happening very quickly. And it can be very unsettling. It can be very scary. But what I say to everybody is welcome to Wînipêk.
Wînipêk, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centers, out through McClel and Stewart right now. Niigaan, thanks very much for taking some time to join me on the program.
Well, me, Wetch, thanks so much for having me.